are still groping for a functional and workable budgetary process. We've made a significant step in that direction with the Budget Reform Act, but it's been a halting and faltering step, and we're not by any means all the way home on a really workable budget process. And then, and I conclude, the most important of all, money. Ladies and gentlemen, this building has the stench of money. The Capitol building has the stench of money. The three House office buildings have the stench of money. And money has its pervasive and evil influence on this process in a whole host of ways. One, it takes up an extraordinary amount of the senator's time to try to raise it. When I came here in 1968, you could raise enough money in the sixth year of your term. And you didn't even have to start on January of the sixth year. You could maybe start around March and raise an adequate amount of money for your campaign. I now know senators who start in year one of their 6 years, and then in their final 2 or 3 years devote 3/4 and even more of their time to fundraising, thinking about it, planning it, executing it, losing sleep over it. That's wrong. That's wrong. And then the influence that the money has. The PACs are just the tip of the iceberg. It's the most notorious tip of the iceberg. It is by no means the total story. The influence that money has in the predetermination of a senator's position or opinion. Let me give one example and I'll be through. Suppose I had run for re-election in 1986, and suppose the tobacco lobby, and I just pick out one, I could pick any group. I could take the AFL-CIO, I could take the truckers, I could take the chamber, I could take the pharmaceutical industry. But suppose the tobacco people came to me and said, we're interested, Senator, in contributing to your campaign. I'd be stunned if they did, but suppose they came in, and we'd like to contribute $10,000. I would know if I took that $10,000 what the tobacco folks were interested in, indeed what they wanted. I know what kind of support programs they want for tobacco growers. I know what kind of labeling they don't want on packages of cigarettes, etc. I know their agenda. So if I take the $10,000, I'm hitched to that agenda. Or I'm an ingrate, or whatever you want to call it. So I'm predetermined just by the receipt of that $10,000. I've signed on board, not in writing, not in a contract, not even a handshake, just by the mere fact that I've received a hefty contribution from an interest group, and I know what their agenda is and what they expect. These folks around here that are handing out this money are not giving it to the little sisters of the poor. This is not an exercise in the American Red Cross. This is not an exercise in national philanthropy. Folks that are handing out fives and 10,000s, and then they can aggregate them and bundle them and all kinds of new political techniques, they're interested in tangible legislative results. That's what they're interested in. And it's gotten to an obnoxious and dangerous level. Dangerous for democracy. So for all of those 4 reasons, I submit that the United States Senate is no longer the greatest deliberative body on earth.
Thank you very much, Senator. Little wonder that Missouri is saddened by losing a great champion of their causes and a great leader in the Senate. I'd like to ask Senator Mattingly now, since he's fresh from the campaign trail, and since Senator Eagleton has gone into Senate campaign financing, one of the real problems that we see facing the Senate is that so much time is consumed with both raising money and thanking people afterwards and following up, of course, with commitments that one has to make. This last election that we've just gone through is estimated to cost about $1 billion. We can see that about $356 million were spent by the candidates themselves. It's hard work, as all of them can attest, to constantly get out and campaign. But the last campaign was singular in that there were a lot of 30-second spots. There were a lot of quick negative judgments about people, and we missed the Eagleton days and the Strom Thurmond days when people actually got out to rallies and when they got out and did handshaking and did personal encounters. Now it's all on television. It's very difficult. Other countries have taken a lead in solving this problem. For instance, Brazil, as we just noted, has said, okay, for our elections, we're going to set aside an hour a week for free public television, all of the networks, all of them giving over to nothing but political speeches and political campaigning. This seems to have worked for Brazil. I don't know that it would work for this country, but it has been a suggested solution. Senator Mattingly, you're fresh in from the fields of campaigning. What is your observation, and what would be your solutions to some of the obvious problems that we're confronted with?
Well, first, I want to address the other issue.
Okay.
I think, this was tried to address the Senate rules and procedures, which is what I would like to address.
Okay.
And then we can address that later. I would say that, if somebody did not like, as Senator Eagleton was saying, that spent 20 years up here, then, it was the same process, but just at a lower level 20 years ago. So I would think that, if people did not like the process, they probably shouldn't participate in it. But I think that, the majority of people do want to participate in the electoral process. And, what the amount of monies are today versus what they were 20 years ago, probably if you put in the fudge factor for inflation, it may be about the same, Tom. I'm not quite certain. But first, I would really like to address, the main issue of what we're talking about, of whether we are in paralysis in the United States Senate. And I think Senator Scott addressed that very eloquently from the standpoint that maybe that was part of the intent of the United States Senate, that maybe it's not supposed to be rolling down the road every day, passing tons of legislation and making the life of people in the United States totally miserable all the time. But, I would say that, maybe a lot of people try to criticize the institution, but yet I really believe that it works, that we'll stop for you, Mark.
This is Senator Mark Andrews.
Good to see you. Good.
Hello, Marco. Hi, Tom. How are you?
But just looking at the institution and seeing how it has worked, I recall that my first 2 years in the United States Senate, I served not only in the Appropriation Committee, which I continued to serve for 6 years, but I also served on the Ethics Committee with Senator Eagleton. And I watched at that time of how the institution really worked. That, in fact, that the Ethics Committee had been working something like 8 months prior to my even coming to the United States Senate, 14 months after that, in reference to a trying to really clean up its own house in reference to Senator Williams' affair. And, in fact, the United States Ethics Committee did function. The full United States Senate did function, and it did deliver. And I think that we see also that the authorizing committees in the United States Senate work. That, in fact, we do debate a lot of the great issues of the day. If you just want to look, and I probably won't have them in any particular order when I repeat them from this year, but in fact, we did debate and come to agreement on debating of the Contra issue twice in the United States Senate, once in the House of Representatives. We, in fact, did debate the issue of economic sanctions and passed the legislation in reference to South Africa. Those are major issues. We did, in fact, debate several times and deliver passage both in the House and the United States Senate on textile legislation, which was a major issue of the day. That we did, in fact, debate the judges that came out of the Judiciary Committee and did, in fact, have great debates, I think, on the floor of the United States Senate. So we're talking about aid to the freedom fighters in Nicaragua, South Africa, textile legislation, and several judges. We did, in fact, do a lot of things that I think that the American people really expected the United States Senate to do, and probably that was conceived by the Founding Fathers for this institution. So a lot of times when, I guess, the biggest critics of the institution are the inmates, which are the 100 in the United States Senate. And we do try to say that we would like to improve it, and some people talk about the quality of life. Well, if the quality of life is so bad here, why are so many people trying to get inside? So I would just say that that maybe, in fact, that positive things are happening in the United States Senate. I feel that getting back to what is needed, maybe what it needs to be changed in the United States Senate and probably in our government, has been addressed through time from the conception of our republic. And it was saw fit to make those changes by constitutional amendments. And they have, in fact, come by time during the 200 and some odd years of our institution to make changes when there has been a direct need in something happening that the Senate or the Congress could not really adjust to. That's when constitutional amendments came forth. And Senator Eagleman was exactly right when he said about money. Now, whether it's money for campaigns or whether it's money just to operate this place or whatever it is. But we now have $1 trillion a year budget in the United States. That's what's stopping up the institution. I think that we do, in fact, debate the great issues of the day. But the problem is we've got $1 trillion budget. We've got a 1974 Budget Act, Empowerment and Control Act, that was supposed to be put into effect that would, in fact, solve this problem. And it has not solved the problem. So therefore, what is the resolution of that problem? We made a small attempt at it with the Graham-Rudman-Hollings amendment to the 74 Budget Control Act. And that, in fact, is not going to solve the problem. So I would say that maybe what this institution needs to look at, and maybe quit worrying about its own turf problems, but looking at a passage of a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, passage of instituting by statute or constitutional amendment the line item veto for presidential use, whether it's a Democrat or Republican. It wouldn't bother me. But I'm saying this is the problem that we have. I have served 6 years on the Senate Appropriations Committee. We, in fact, jumped through hoop after hoop, not only the Appropriations Committee, but the Budget Committee, the authorizing committees. If we sat here, we debate every issue in the whole total Congress a minimum of 6 times on defense. You will discuss it on defense appropriations, you will discuss it on the Armed Services Committee, and we discuss it on the Budget Committee. So really what we have is the failure of the institution and its ability to really fund the government, Now, years ago, when it was a smaller budget, it could be done. But now, the rules and procedures of the United States Senate do not adapt itself to trying to debate $1 trillion worth of different items throughout this budget process. So I would say that, that the issues or the problems of the day generally cry out for help. And I think the big cry today is for this budget process we have in the United States Congress that obviously does not work. Then anything that's such a failure as the 74 Budget Control Act should not be sacrosanct to change. So I would say that the institution, as I think Senator Scott said, whether it was an effective body, it was probably not meant to be an effective body. But yet, I think that the debates that they have on the floor of the United States Senate, and I would hate to go back and recall all the 6 years of debates that I've heard, and they've been eloquent. And they've been eloquent by my good friend from Missouri and Senator Thurmond and many others on the floor of the United States Senate. And we have addressed the problems, I think, many of the problems of the people of our country. But the major problem that has not been addressed is the one of the budget process. And I would say if we can resolve that either by a constitutional amendment to balance the budget with a line item veto or some new idea, then I think that's what we need to look forward to.
Thank you very much. Senator Thurmond, as Senator Pro Tem, obviously you're on the floor an awful lot, and your service has been tremendous there. But can you just give us some insights and observations of your own as to the procedures of how the Senate works and how it could be improved?
Well, in my 32 years in the Senate, I'm convinced we've got to make some changes. Now, I believe I talked for the longest time on a filibuster of anyone in the Senate. Is only a question of right of trial by jury. The reason I talked that long is that a statute was up to change the right of trial by jury situation. In 1957, the Constitution provides anyone charged with a crime shall have a trial by jury. Even if you violate a traffic regulation, you can get a trial by the city recorder or a magistrate's case may be, whose jurisdiction is probably $100 or 30 days. But under this particular statute that Lyndon Johnson worked out, it provided that if the punishment is over $300 or over 45 days in jail, you get a trial by jury. Otherwise, you would not. That completely violates the Constitution, in my judgment. The case later went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld it. That was the Warren Court. If you had the Baker Court, I'm quite sure they would not have upheld it. I think there's that much difference. Now, the question of filibusters, I think should be retained, but I think the rules should be changed. When I filibustered, I spoke for 24 hours and 18 minutes. Now, that might seem like a long time, but if you're in pretty good shape, you can do that. Now, when I got through, I'm not boasting, but I could have spoken longer if necessary, but I was trying to dramatize to the American people that you can't change the Constitution by a statute. And that's what was attempted to be done, because the Constitution guarantees a trial by jury when one is charged with a crime. And this statute would change it. Under 45 days or under $300, you would not get a trial by jury. And that's the reason that I spoke as I did, to try to dramatize the matter to the American people. I knew it would be defeated. I knew my position would be defeated. But after that time, after I spoke, they shortly had a vote, and I took no step to hold it up further by offering amendments, as has been done, referred to by Senator Eagleton, where you can offer 1,000 or 5,000 amendments. But I think it should be changed so that once you get filibuster, and the number has been reduced from 66, I believe, or 67 down to 60, but you have to get 60 now to stop debate, which I think is all right to do. But once you get to 60, then the matter should be over. Maybe allow an hour for amendments or anything else. In my judgment, that should end it. It should not go on forever. Now, roll calls. You'll notice on the information I have here, it says that last year the Senate spent the equivalent of 3 months taking roll calls. That's ridiculous. I think Senator Scott brought out a good point there, that we could vote like the House does, punch a button and vote, and get through in 3 or 4 minutes, 75 minutes. And here we spent 3 months on roll calls, wasting the time of the people, putting the government to that expense, the taxpayers. And that's a vital change that I think should be made. Now, on the matter of the Budget Committee, and they had no Budget Committee when I first came here. That was established a few years ago. We have a big fight over the budget. As to defense is going to get so much, social matters so much, and that's a long, hard fight. Then you got to go into appropriations, and you got a long, hard fight there. You got authorizations even before you get appropriations. You got 3 steps: budget, authorization, appropriation. I think it might well be considered that the authorizing committees could do the appropriating too. Why have that duplication? State legislatures don't have it. And why should Congress have it? It seems once we act on the budget, then the authorizing committees could be called authorizing and appropriations if necessary, and that would save months of work. I'm convinced that would be very important. Now, I believe Senator Eagleton brought out about the germaneness question. He said you could have a bill here in the District of Columbia and offer most anything to it. Probably that should be changed to restrict legislation to germaneness. certainly maybe unless you get 3/4 of the Senate to agree to some emergency matter otherwise. There are many changes that I think could be made that would shorten the work, improve efficiency, and I believe would please the taxpayers very much if they were acted upon. Those are just a few matters that come to my attention right at the moment. And I'm confident that these matters could be accomplished and should be accomplished. I realize it's hard to get a change, hard to get a change of rules. It's hard to get a change of custom. It's hard to get a change of tradition. But the time has come, I think, when the American people are demanding more efficiency, shorter sessions, and to get through. When I came here originally, December 1954, actually came in January 55, we would finish the session by August or September. I would go to South Carolina and spend the fall in South Carolina. Now we're here the year round. I've had to move up here, move my family up here entirely. The children in school up here year round. I don't know whether that's wise or not, but at any rate, I really don't think it's wise to keep this Senate in session or the Congress in session as long as we do. We ought to be able to finish this work here in 6 months. And I think some steps have got to be taken where one man can't hold up this Senate too long, for a reasonable length of time, maybe one day, day and a half, something like that, but time has come when we've got to act, we've got to go forward. We can keep it a great deliberative body, but do it in a reasonable way. Now, it can be done in an unreasonable way. These changes, I think, are timely, and I hope they will be made.
Thank you very much, Senator. Before we get back to Senator Mattingly and a little more on the budget process, particularly his comments on the 2-year budget cycle, we'd like to hear from Senator Mark Andrews, very distinguished, very popular senator from the Midwest.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here, and let me, as a creature of the House probably more than the Senate, because I've spent 17 years in the House and just the last 6 years in the Senate, combine what I learned from both bodies into what I think could be some of the steps we can take to resolve the issues that have been raised by my colleagues. Strom, I'm not against a filibuster. I think a filibuster for a good cause by a senator is in the best traditions of the Senate. The fact that we're now on television, nobody's going to go into an extended filibuster unless there's a great and good reason for it. But the filibuster that we have, by the, shall we say, death of 1,000 cuts, is what holds up the Senate's process. We do everything in this body now 3 times. But mention why we ought to resolve the budget process. That's true. But remember, I can recall a decade or more ago when the public and the press came in and said, you don't have any discipline. You've got to get the deficit under control. How do we get it under control? We invent yet another committee. So we invented that other committee, the Budget Committee. Mind you, I've been on the Budget Committee now for 6 years in the Senate. I was on the Appropriations Committee in the Senate. I've been on an Authorizing Committee. I was on the Appropriations Committee since 1964 in the House. I've been on the Appropriations Committee longer than Mark Hatfield. He was my chairman. Tom and I used to sit across in conferences when I was an appropriator from the House and he was one from the Senate. And you know, in the early 70s, there began to have a turf problem between the authorizers and the appropriators. And the authorizers said, you guys on appropriations are getting too much in the limelight. Therefore, we think we shall do annual authorizations. Suddenly, we had annual authorizations for the State Department, the Defense Department, for the Agriculture Department, for a whole lot of other things. And the authorizing committees didn't do their job, which is to oversee long-time permanent legislation and straighten out the glitches in it and make it work better. They were in doing what the Appropriations Committee was supposed to be doing. And they were getting in each other's way to the point where the appropriators couldn't do their job until after the authorizers had done their annual authorizations. Then the public clamor came to do something about the budget, so we put the Budget Committee in. Now we find ourselves waiting until the Budget Committee finishes before the appropriators can even look at something, but they can't look at it until the authorizers have done it. So we pushed the fiscal year back, and we've gone on and on ad nauseum, and we've held up the work of the people. But more important than that, what we've done is we've wrapped up the authorizing committees in the annual authorization process, and as a result, we've had not enough oversight, not enough review about the ongoing programs that ought to be examined, ought to be overhauled on a regular basis. And we've lost as a nation because of it. Say, okay, Mark, what would you suggest? Don't propound the problem without coming up with a solution. One, I'd abolish the Budget Committee, right quick. Two, I would substitute a rules change. The rules change would be very simple. Any amendment on the floor of the House or the Senate had to be revenue neutral. In other words, no more of these wonderful bleeding heart amendments to put another $1 billion in to fight cancer, or $2 billion for a farm program, or whatever else, without saying what you're going to take it from, or what taxes you're going to raise to pay for it. That's responsibility in the amendment process. And if you will check, you'll find the Appropriations Committee in the House has year after year after year done its job. It's come in every year under the President's budget. It's when it's gotten to the floor, those figures have been inflated by people who want to make a great reputation for themselves or whatever. Then they come to the Senate. The Senate's always got to do better than the House. Gets to the Senate floor, they've got to do better than the Senate committee did, and the budget gets out of hand. So I would suggest do away with a budget committee, shorten that time span, let people concentrate on authorizations and do the overhaul of the long ongoing programs in the authorizing committees, and let the appropriations process work, with that caveat that on the floor we have a situation where you have to have a revenue neutral amendment. Now, backing that up with one more rules change, Strom, would make the Senate work better and still protect the right for an honest filibuster. Our filibuster is the filibuster by absence. I've managed bills on the floor of the Senate, so have all of us at this table. We sat and we've waited and we've waited and we've waited for good old Joe, who's having a 3-martini lunch someplace, who's going to come up and show up, but we got to wait for him because he's got some kind of an amendment. So we have filibuster by quorum call. It's ridiculous. That's why we don't get the people's business done. The one rules change we need in the Senate, above all else, is not to stop a filibuster that's a legitimate filibuster, but to very simply say that when a bill is called up for action on the floor of the Senate, the managers of that bill, if no one is there to offer an amendment, can ask the clerk to read, much as we do in the House. And if the clerk reads into the next title, the previous title is closed for amendment except by unanimous consent. In other words, you got to have your duff on the floor paying attention to business, or you're not going to hold up the whole Senate and the country as well. Bills that now take a week and a half to process could be done effectively in a day. And everybody's rights to be heard would be protected. So as I say, that type of a section-by-section reading, closing the previous section for amendment except by unanimous consent, would give us the discipline. The two combined, I think, would protect the rights of unlimited debate, would protect the rights of this country to have one of its legislative bodies where, as Strom points out, you can have a filibuster, and finally end up the stop, shall we say, the duplication we have with doing everything in triplicate. Doing everything in triplicate has meant that this year we didn't get our appropriations bills done, even though we slipped some years ago the fiscal year by 3 months to help us do that. And as a result, we stuck everything into a continuing resolution, and those of us who are appropriators of any kind of standing can put cats, rats, dogs, you name it, into that continuing resolution, and the business of the Republic is not well done. So I would suggest those changes would make this place work a lot better, and not just for the inmates, but it would serve the people of this Republic far better if those kinds of disciplines were put into place. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. It's too bad those can't instantly go into effect, because I feel that you probably would have adjourned by July if those were on boards, and you wouldn't have all these late-night votes.
More importantly, we'd get the business of the nation done, and done well.
Exactly. The other thing is, too, that I think in this session we had something like 36 votes after midnight. We had something like 150 votes after 8 o'clock at night. Well, I think Senator Mattingly makes a very good point. If you can't stand, I think somebody else has said this, but if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. I think that was your Missouri friend, Senator Eagleton. But I'd like to go back to Senator Mattingly and ask him to talk a little bit more about the budget process and about, there's been a lot of suggestions. One has been the 2-year budget cycle. Senator Mattingly, what is the answer in addition to what Senator Andrews has very well put?
Well, I think that there has been a desire, I think, for the last 2 or 3 years of trying to go to a 2-year budget cycle. There are those on the other side of that issue who say, well, the Congress could take 2 years to get to the budget also. But hopefully, I think that, I don't believe there's anything set in concrete that says it has to be 2 years. It could be 3 years even. But that is just part of it. I think of trying to go to a 2-year budget and getting back to the process that we talk about here in reference to all the different hoops you have to go through, whether you're talking about the Budget Committee, then the Authorizing Committee, then the Appropriations Committee, and you do the same thing, then the House of Representatives. Then, on top of all that we're talking about, let me just try to explain it. If the Budget Committee meets in the Senate and they meet in the House, and eventually they have to go meet together, then come back and vote it again. Then the Authorizing Committee does the same thing in the Senate and the House. And then they go to the House-Senate Conference Committee. Then they come back for another vote. Same thing with the Appropriations Committee. Supposedly, when they pass one in the House of Representatives and the Senate passes one, that they're supposed to go to a House-Senate Conference Committee. But I think there's reasons why some of those things never happen. Basically this year, the reason why they did not happen under the 13 was the bills that passed the House of Representatives and then they would pass the United States Senate. The House, through Tip O'Neill, would not allow them to go to conference. That's sort of the bottom line that I know as chairman of military construction, when the House of Representatives passed their bill, then I passed mine in August, that we never, ever went to conference because the House would never assign any committee members to go to that conference, which means it stifled us going to a conference and getting our work done in the United States Congress. So I would think that, I think you have to probably get both bodies together in reference to some of the appropriation process. But I think it goes back, though, to the 74 Budget Control Act just does not work. I mean, why do you want to stick with something that fails? I mean, I believe everybody here, we're going on in the 13th year of operation of the 74 Budget Control Act, and it really doesn't work. That we keep delaying the process, as Senator Andrews says, that the Budget Committee sort of, they probably ought to wipe it out, is what he says. But whether you wipe that out or whether you consolidate Authorizing Appropriations Committee, what is it that, obviously we have too many committees. I was, for the last 2 years, of all things, was the chairman of the Committee on Committees. That tells you something. 2 years ago, this coming January, the United States Senate had 231 full committees and subcommittees. 231. There's 100 members. They were getting ready to move to 245 committees and subcommittees. We finally got there. I don't believe there is a Committee on Committees on the Democrat side, just on the Republican side, and the Democrat leader controls it over there. But we met and got with a group of them to try to say, let's try to tamp this thing down a little bit. We finally got it back, I believe, to 217. We reduced it from 231 down to 217. And Senator Andrews is right. There are a lot of people that are turf conscious. They believe that as a United States Senator, if you don't chair a committee or not a ranking member on a committee, you can't do anything. Well, that's not so. I think if you see the amendments that are put forth on the floor of the United States Senate, or bills that are put forward on the floor of the United States Senate, and I have no facts with me, but many of them are not really relevant to the membership of a committee. So therefore, a 1 in 100 has a tremendous amount of power in this body. So the establishment of all those committees and subcommittees have just proliferated during the last few years, and I'm not certain who instigated all that, but I'm probably as many Republicans instigated as did Democrats. But obviously, it does not work. You know, I, in my tenure, served on 13 full committees and subcommittees. It's an impossible task to attend all 13 committees and subcommittees, and it's really not useful. But that is just part of the process and part of maybe of where we want to criticize it. But just listening to say how hard they work in the United States Senate, let me give you an example. That through October the 17th, there were 290 days in this calendar year, of which the Senate was in session half that time. Half that time. I think 143 days. Where were the other 147 days? While you, as citizens of our country, got off 1 day for Labor Day, I think we got off 3 weeks. Sounds right to me. But what I'm trying to say to you is that we were in session roughly half of the time. We really weren't in session all year. So they were back.